My name is Emmanuel Shu. Sorry if my voice is a little hoarse. I think those crusty jalapenos got me a little hoarse. But anyway, my name is Emmanuel Shu. I've been in the church here in Atlanta for the past 3.5 years, although I grew up in the church. And I'm a husband, I'm a father of 4 kids, I live in Grant Park, and I work as a family physician. If you guys don't know, there's actually a physician in the Bible. His name is Luke. And we're actually going to talk about some verses from the book of Luke and the book of Acts today. But anyway, that's just a little bit about me. I'm glad to be here with you all. So these series of meetings, we've been covering the matter of eternity and specifically the steps of God's process. And before I begin on the topic of tonight's meeting, I just want to say, it's been a long time since I've been in college and high school, but I still remember what it was like. And college is a special time. You're independent of your parents. I mean, to some degree, right? Living on your own. You're not being handed things. You're not being spoon-fed things, and you're really kind of on your own and independent for the first time in your life. And because of that kind of outward circumstance, it's really a time where you start to realize who you are and what you want to do in your life, right? So when you're in college, and especially if you're away from home, you got some basic questions for your life. You want to know, what am I going to do with my life? What am I going to be? What do I want to be? Or maybe more concrete, what should I major in, right? That's a question every college student has to answer. Second question, maybe, I don't know, maybe more of the sisters than the brothers, but who am I going to marry, Brothers too? Okay, well, anyway, so I know, the brothers are probably like, nah, whatever, but, I know a lot of brothers are like, well, who am I going to marry? Number 3 is probably the most crucial question is, what is the meaning of my life? So we all have these questions, especially when we're in college. And, the answers might come during that time, it might come later. But those questions are really deep in our being. And we all have to kind of answer it in our own way or come to our own conclusion. But I just want to give you guys the short answer here. The meaning of your life is not money. It's not a successful career. It's not relationships. It's not entertainment. It's not power, political power, whatever kind of power. And, it's none of these things. The meaning of your human life is something eternal. Amen. And, in the Old Testament, there is this famous guy. His name was Solomon, and he was a king. He was the ruler of the known universe at that time. And he had unimaginable wealth. I mean, the next richest guy to him was like a little peon, but he had unimaginable wealth. He was the ruler of the known universe, so he had all this power. He had like 300 wives, 700 concubines, and he had all this property and everything. And yet, he wrote this book in the Bible called Ecclesiastes, and in the first chapter he says, vanity of vanities. All is vanity. So can you imagine? I mean, this is like Elon Musk. Maybe not as crazy, but he's like the Elon Musk of his age. He has all this stuff and power, but at the end he says, vanity of vanities. All this stuff that I have, all the power, all the wealth, it's just vanity of vanities. And then a couple chapters later in chapter 3, he says, he's talking about the people of God, but he says, God has put eternity in their hearts. So what he's saying is that, you have this thing called eternity that God has planted in your heart. So there's another philosopher, actually a church father, who said that in each of us we have a God-shaped vacuum. This is the eternity that is in our heart. So if you imagine King Solomon or maybe Elon Musk, whatever, you're trying to fill this God-shaped vacuum with electric vehicles or Tesla or SpaceX, going to Mars, whatever. You're trying to fill it with all these things, but nothing will ever fill that God-shaped vacuum except God himself, who is the eternal one. The only thing that's going to fill that eternity in your heart is the eternal one, God. So, again, we all have to answer these questions ourselves. I'm not trying to give you the answer, but we all have to come to this conclusion eventually, whether it's in our college age or it's later in our years or after we get married and we have a family and we have a job. We all have to answer this question to ourselves. What am I here for, right? It's not for these temporary things, for these things that eventually fall apart and turn to vanity. It is for the eternal thing, who is God himself. So, and you know, I believe that, especially during our college years, I believe that the Lord really wants to call us. And, you know, the Lord calls us all the time, even on a daily basis. But when you're in college, the Lord really calls young people in a special way because you're unfettered, you're free, you have all this time and energy. Okay, maybe you don't have so much money, but you have all this time and energy, and you can, and your whole being is unoccupied, and you can really give yourself to the Lord. So I hope, you know, whether it's tonight or at the college retreat that's in 2 weeks, you know, I hope that God would personally call some of you to really consecrate yourself to him and to give yourself to the things that are eternal and not the vanity of the world. So anyway, that's just a little preface. But tonight we're coming to this step of human living. I'm not going to draw the diagram like some other brothers have in previous weeks. But basically, after God's incarnation, we have this period of human living. So we all know that Jesus lived on the earth for how many years? 33 and a half, right? So, you know, we know that the last 3.5 years he was going around teaching his disciples. He was ministering to people. He was healing people, doing miracles. What happened in the first 30 years? Anyone know? Yeah, it was growing up. Does the Bible talk about that period? A little bit. Very little bit. So actually, you know, actually it was a little bit more than 33 and a half years because he spent 9 months in the womb of Mary, right? So it's probably a little bit more than 30, probably more like 34 years. But, you know, he was a fetus in Mary's womb. I mean, this is pretty incredible, right? The God of the universe was in Mary's womb. You know, why did he have to go through that? Have you ever asked this? I mean, have you ever wondered? Why did he have to go through that process of being in the womb and being born through, you know, born through a woman? And why did he have to go through this process of growing up as a kid and a child and a teenager? I mean, he was a teenager. I'm going to get to that in a bit, but, you know, and young adult, why did he have to go through all that? Right? I mean, why couldn't God have just made him a fully matured man and then he ministered and go to the cross to die, right? Why? Does anyone know? Okay, well, there's a lot of reasons, but I'm going to give you one good reason today. So, you know, there's one chapter in the Bible that mentions this period where Jesus was growing up as a kid, and it's Luke 2. So I'm going to read the verse because I don't want to misquote it. But and if you have a Bible, you can follow along. But Luke 2, chapter 2, verse 40 says, "And the little child grew and became strong, and the grace of God was upon him." You know, we shouldn't take any verse in the Bible for granted. And I would love to read this verse, but, you know, this verse is very significant, actually. It says, the little child, that's Jesus, he grew, okay? So he was growing physically, and he became strong. Does that mean he was lifting weights and, you know, spending time in the gym building muscles? Not necessarily. It means he was becoming strong in his spirit. So, you know, the Bible doesn't waste words. When it says he became strong, that means he was being strengthened from inside, not merely outside. And the next phrase after that says, "And the grace of God was upon him." So what is the strength that he was developing within him? It was the grace of God. The grace of God was his strength. Okay, so what does this all mean? If you look at the baby Jesus, or the boy Jesus, say he was 4 or 5 years old, this boy had God in him. This was God in the flesh, okay? Did he know that? I don't know. He probably had some realization that God was in him, that he was God in the flesh. But I don't think he entirely knew everything that meant. And there's people who interpret the Bible, and there's a quote from somebody who interpreted it. He said, "The wisdom of the Savior's deity was revealed in proportion to the measure of his bodily growth." So as a little kid, he probably didn't realize what was really within him. He had probably some realization, but not full. But as he grew in his physical stature, his realization of who he was and who was in him grew as well. And that became his strength. That was his becoming strong. So, again, I don't think a lot of us have thought about this before, but, Jesus growing up as a boy, he wasn't born with that full knowledge that he was the infinite God in the flesh. But he had to come to that realization as he grew. Okay, so after that verse in chapter 2, then Luke gives this little story, right? So Jesus' parents, Mary and Joseph, went to Jerusalem and brought him with them to celebrate the Passover feast. And after the week was over, they were going back with all the relatives, and along the way, Mary and Joseph were like, where's Jesus? Where's Jesus? And for a whole day, right, they were like asking among the relatives, where's our son? You guys aren't parents yet, most of you, but as a parent, you get pretty worried if you can't find your kid for 24 hours. So they went back to Jerusalem, and they were searching for 3 days. 3 whole days looking for Jesus. And then finally they went to the temple and found him. And of course they were upset, right? I mean, any parent would be naturally upset and said, what are you doing? We're so worried about you. And he said, do you not know who I am? I have to be in my Father's things. You should have looked in the temple first because, I have to be in my Father's things. And so that showed in a little bit, he realized who he was inside. He was God, and he had God the Father in him. But the next verse, what does it say? And he subjected himself to his parents. So, this was Jesus as a 12-year-old boy with God the Father in him. And even though he knew he had to be in the temple doing the things of his Father, he was like cross-examining the lawyers and teachers, right? But he knew he had to be there. But yet, in the next verse, he says he subjected himself to his parents. Okay? So, I have a 12-year-old son and an 18-year-old son. And one of the hardest things for them to do is to subject themselves to their mom. Especially the 18-year-old, because he knows everything. He has watched every YouTube video on the earth. He knows all these facts. And whenever mom is like, no, you're wrong, he's like, I'm right. I know I'm right. And so it's very hard for my sons to, and this starts when you're 12 years old. You're on the preteen years, on the cusp of teenage years. And that's when it's the hardest, probably the hardest, to subject yourself not only to your dad, but more so to your mom, right? Because especially for a son to subject himself to his mom, it's hard. But he subjected himself to his parents. So, imagine if you're God in the flesh and you have to be in your Father's things, and yet you subject yourself to your parents, who maybe don't even realize who you are, right? But he subjected himself. Do you think that required grace? Do you think that required grace? Absolutely. I don't think anybody could do that without the grace of God being your strength, right? So, my point is that as he grew, he started to realize what was within him and who he was. And he learned to take the grace of God as his strength in order to live this human life. So there's a good footnote in the Recovery Version on this verse. And I really love this quote. It says, as a man, even Jesus needed the grace of God for his human life. So, here's Jesus. Again, he's God in the flesh. He does not have the sinful nature contaminating his soul and his flesh. But even Jesus, as a man, he needed the grace of God to live his human life, right? So, again, you guys are still young, so you haven't experienced all the travails and sufferings of parenthood and jobs and paying bills and mortgages and all this stuff, but believe me, it's coming. But, the human life is hard. It's hard. Even in college, it's hard. I mean, you got pressures, social pressures, pressures to make grades or to please your parents or whatever, but the human life is hard. Even without considering our sinful nature and the sin in our flesh, it's hard. If you don't have the grace of God, I don't know how we can make it, to be honest. And I think this is why a lot of people in the world go crazy, because they don't have the grace of God. So how much, even with the sinful nature, we need the grace of God. We need the grace of God to live our human life, right? And so this is something that we have to learn. So let's read the first verse on this outline. It's Ephesians 4:20 through 21. And we can just read it all together. So, but you did not so learn Christ, if indeed you have heard him and have been taught in him, as the reality is in Jesus. So these are some of my favorite verses in the Bible. They're a little bit quirky because they have these phrases that don't sound right, like learn Christ. I mean, it doesn't say learn about Christ or learn from Christ. It just says learn Christ, right? And then this phrase, as the reality is in Jesus. I mean, just kind of awkward sounding, right? But these phrases actually have a lot of meaning because they're only used in this place in the Bible. So what does it mean to learn Christ? Well, when I was in college, we had this saying, WWJD, right? Do people still say that? WWJD? No? Yeah. WWJD, it's an acronym. It means, what would Jesus do, right? So WWJD, it was popular when I was in college. I don't know about now, but basically it meant that, if you're struggling through something or you're in a certain circumstance or situation, think about what Jesus did and do that, right? So that's what a lot of people, that's what their concept is of learning Christ, is WWJD. What would Jesus do? Well, he might have done this, so we'll do that. But learning Christ is much more subjective than that. There's another verse in 1 Peter 2:21. I'm not going to have you guys read that, but basically in that verse, Peter says that Christ left us a model so that we may follow in his steps. So in other words, Christ's living was this model that we should follow. And again, that could be taken very objectively, like what would Jesus do? Well, we follow his model. But actually, this word in the Greek means underwriting. Underwriting. The Greek word is literally ipogramos, which means under. Ipo means under. Gramos means word or writing. So in the old days, they didn't have printers. So they would have, if they wanted to spread the word about something, they would have somebody write a master copy, and then they have a whole room of people, scribes literally, who would copy that and then disseminate all the stone tablets or whatever it was. My kids are trying to learn Chinese. Chinese is a very pictorial kind of language. So when the Chinese teacher gives them homework, she writes out characters or prints them out, and they have to copy them like 10 times each, okay? This is what the model is like. It means that you're copying something with ink on a paper. So again, that sounds very objective, but actually it's very subjective. Because we also know from another book in the Bible, 2 Corinthians, that Paul says, you are a letter of Christ. You are a letter of Christ. And what he's talking to the believers, you are letters. Not like ABCD, but letters that we write. You guys are letters of Christ ministered by us inscribed not with ink, but with the Spirit. So you are inscribed with the Spirit, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of flesh. In other words, in your heart. So the upshot of all this is that when we are taking Christ as our model, it's not just an outward thing. We have to have the Christ as a spirit inscribed on our hearts. And that becomes the duplicate of the original, right? Christ is like the OG. He's not the gangster. He's the original God-man, right? OG. But he was the original copy. And now he is being duplicated or reproduced, or you could say Xerox copy. I know you guys don't know what Xerox is, but he's being reproduced in our hearts in exactly the same way that he lived. So the final point of this is, if you look in Acts, the last 2 or 3 chapters of Acts 26 to 28, again, Acts is written by Luke, the beloved physician. I hope somebody calls me a beloved physician one day, but Acts was written by Luke as well. And in these last 2 or 3 chapters of Acts, he describes this long voyage of Paul going from Jerusalem to Rome, where Caesar is, because he petitioned Caesar. And it's a very detailed account of his journey. He gets on this boat, and the boat goes through a storm, and people go hungry, and some guys fall off the boat and die, and then they get shipwrecked on this island with these barbarians, and some snake bites Paul's hand, and he shakes it off into the fire, and the barbarians are like, oh, he must be a god. This whole story, and I used to read this, I was like, why is this story in here? Like the last chapters of Acts, why is it even in here? Why is it talking about all these things? But if you read that story and read between the lines, you realize that the kind of life and living that Paul displayed on that whole tortured trip was just a duplication of the life that Jesus lived. So again, you can read the Gospels and all the details of everything that Jesus did while he was on the earth in his ministry and his growing up. And there's a lot of stories there, but what's happening behind the scenes is that God is being inscribed in his heart. God is expanding in his being. And the same thing with Paul. You can read the story and there's all these funny details, but actually what's being displayed there is that God is being lived again through a human being. Just as God was being lived through Jesus in his human life, God was being lived through Paul in his human life. And that's exactly what God's purpose is. He wants to repeat his human life in all of you. Believe it or not, he does. I think this is really where the rubber meets the road is, we have to realize that in order to have this kind of living, we need to depend on the grace of God, right? So the last point on this outline, and again, I didn't cover everything, but the last point on this outline is that Jesus lived with the Father. He never was disconnected from the Father. The Father was with him, and the Father was in him, and he was living with him. So this is the kind of living that we have to have, and that will result in the God-man living, is a living that is with God. Right? Like last week, they talked about this word from with. We are from with God. God is in our living. He is living in us and through us. So this is the whole point of the human living. It's not just nice stories and cool stuff that Jesus did while he was on the earth, but it's really a display of who God is through somebody's human life. And that's what he wants to reproduce in us. And ultimately, that's God's purpose, right? In Genesis 1, what does he want? In the beginning, God created, right? And he said, let us create man in our image, after our likeness. He's after a certain expression of himself through man. So when we fully realize who we are inside, and who we have living in us, that will be the expression that will happen in our human living. So We're not there yet. Nobody is, none of us here. But that's our goal, is to have that kind of living.